Julian Hawke had everything a man could want. A towering mansion overlooking the city, a fleet of luxury cars, the latest technology and the most exclusive memberships. But none of it filled the emptiness inside him. He sat in his office, staring out the window at the busy streets below. His employees, his clients, and even his family treated him like an untouchable figure, a man whose wealth was his identity. Despite his success, something gnawed at him. Julian had always believed that money could buy happiness, but the older he got, the less he believed that. He had everything, yet he felt disconnected from those around him. The people he interacted with on a daily basis, his staff, even his closest friends, were polite but distant, almost as though they were playing roles in his life. They smiled, nodded, and laughed at his jokes, but there was always an unspoken distance. That's when the thought struck him: how well did he really know the people who worked for him? Were they kind because they genuinely cared, or were they just acting, hoping to climb the corporate ladder? Julian's mind raced and he began to wonder. Could money truly make a person generous, or was there something more to it? What if he could strip away his identity as a millionaire and see how the world treated him as a mere man, not someone with endless wealth? What if he disguised himself as a beggar and tested his employees' reactions? Would they be the same kind, compassionate individuals he'd hoped they were? Or would their true colors show in the face of someone who had nothing to offer? With this thought, a plan began to take shape in Julian's mind. It wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a challenge. He would test the generosity of his employees, and the results would tell him more about humanity than any charity gala or boardroom meeting ever could. He had to know the truth. The plan was simple. Julian would disguise himself as a homeless man and visit the restaurant he owned, a high-end establishment known for its impeccable service. The idea of sneaking past his employees without them recognizing him filled him with excitement. He wanted to witness raw human behavior without any filters. He spent the next few days preparing. He rented a shabby apartment, bought some worn clothes, and even went so far as to practice a rough, unshaven look in front of the mirror. It wasn't easy, but he managed to create the perfect disguise. His transformation was so thorough that he barely recognized himself in the mirror. The polished, well-groomed millionaire was gone, replaced by a man who looked as if he had been living on the streets for years. The following morning, Julian walked into the restaurant, blending in with the usual crowd of homeless individuals that sometimes loitered around the area. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked past the restaurant's pristine windows, unsure of what kind of reception he would receive. He was both nervous and excited, eager to see how his employees would react. Inside, the staff was busy preparing for the lunch rush. Julian positioned himself in a quiet corner, where he could watch without being noticed. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, and sat on the edge of the room as if he had no place else to be. It didn't take long for the first reactions to unfold. The maitre d', a sharp-dressed man named Peter, passed by and looked straight through Julian. There was no acknowledgement, no greeting, just a cold, dismissive glance. The young hostess, Sarah, followed suit, looking at him with a mix of pity and distaste before quickly averting her gaze. Neither of them offered any help. Julian frowned, unsure whether to be disappointed or not. He had expected some indifference, but the stark coldness was more than he anticipated. Time passed and more employees filtered in. Julian watched as some glanced at him, then continued with their tasks. Others whispered to each other, casting furtive glances his way. His appearance must have seemed strange to them, but no one made an effort to help or even speak to him. Julian could feel the weight of their indifference pressing down on him. It wasn't until a young waiter, Daniel, approached that things began to change. Daniel, who was relatively new to the restaurant, had been serving drinks to a table nearby. He saw Julian sitting in the corner and, unlike the others, he didn't look away. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to Julian. "Hey, can I get you something? Water, coffee?" Daniel asked with a soft, genuine tone. Julian looked up, surprised by the kindness in the waiter's voice. The young man's eyes were filled with concern, and there was no hint of judgment in his demeanor. It was as though he truly wanted to help, as if he saw Julian not as a beggar, but as a fellow human being. "I'm okay," Julian muttered, keeping his voice rough as he was still trying to maintain the illusion. Daniel smiled warmly and lingered for a moment before walking away. But for Julian, the moment felt like a breakthrough. There was something about Daniel's kindness that left an impression on him. It made him wonder if he had misjudged the people around him. Not all of them had turned their backs on him. This simple act of kindness, though small, stood in stark contrast to the coldness he had witnessed earlier. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, with Julian watching and taking note of how each employee responded to his presence. Some continued to ignore him, while others barely glanced in his direction. He was used to being invisible, but it stung to experience it so directly. However, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's interaction had been something real, something different. It left him wondering, was there more to these people than he had originally believed? As the days passed, Julian couldn't stop thinking about the interaction with Daniel. It had been a small gesture, but it had made a profound impact on him. The more he pondered it, the more he realized that he needed to deepen his experiment, to see if Daniel's kindness was an anomaly or if there was something more to the employees at his restaurant. Julian couldn't allow himself to form conclusions based on one encounter. He decided to come back, this time with a clearer purpose, to test the limits of their generosity. He had to know whether anyone else would be willing to show the same level of compassion. The next day, Julian returned to the restaurant in his disguise. This time he sat at a different table closer to the bar, hoping to gain a different perspective on how the staff behaved in more private moments. He watched as Peter, the maitre d', spoke to the managers and other staff with a certain air of superiority. Julian could see that Peter's dismissive attitude was not just towards him, but it seemed to permeate his interactions with everyone in the restaurant, especially those lower down in the hierarchy. It was clear now. Peter was the kind of person who saw himself as better than those who worked under him. Julian made a mental note of this observation. What struck him the most was how the other employees interacted with Peter. They were deferential, accommodating, and always careful not to upset him. It was as though they were all playing their parts in a game of appearances. Daniel, on the other hand, was the opposite. Julian had noticed earlier that, despite being a newcomer, he didn't just follow the status quo. He was respectful but never subservient. Julian was intrigued. Was Daniel's kindness a genuine part of his character, or was he simply acting out of obligation? Julian needed to test that too. He made a subtle decision to engage Daniel directly, this time with a different approach. He called him over when the restaurant started to get busier. Julian pretended to be frustrated and asked for some assistance with his meal. He wanted to see if Daniel would offer help, even though it wasn't his direct responsibility. "Excuse me," Julian said, keeping his voice shaky and rough. "Could you help me with the menu? I can't read too well." Daniel immediately approached, his eyes softening with understanding. "Of course. I'll help you with that." "No problem," he said as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He took a moment to lean over the table, patiently explaining each item on the menu. The interaction, though simple, was another test passed for Daniel. Unlike the others, he didn't flinch or act as if helping a beggar was beneath him. He treated Julian with respect, as a human being in need, not as a nuisance or inconvenience. As Julian observed, he realized that Daniel's kindness was not out of obligation or fear, but something deeper, something authentic. Perhaps there was still hope for humanity, even in a world that seemed so driven by superficiality and wealth. But Julian knew that his experiment was far from over. He needed to continue watching to see if anyone else would step up in the same way. Julian's experiment continued for a week. He had been returning to the restaurant every day, blending into the background as the homeless man he had become. Each visit he watched, learned, and took mental notes. He had seen kindness in small doses, like Daniel's repeated acts of compassion, but he had also witnessed cold indifference. The question was, how much of this behavior was driven by money and how much was a reflection of genuine character? One afternoon, Julian had an encounter that would shake his assumptions to the core. He had been sitting quietly at the bar, nursing a cup of coffee that barely touched his lips. The hustle and bustle of the restaurant continued around him, and he couldn't help but notice how some of the staff seemed to treat him like a nuisance, while others took the time to avoid him. He noticed Sarah, the young hostess, exchanging looks with some of the other waitstaff, clearly uncomfortable with his presence. As he sat there, a loud voice broke through the din of the restaurant. Peter, the maitre d', was angrily speaking with the restaurant manager, Mark. "I don't know why we keep tolerating these beggars," Peter said in a low, menacing tone. "They're nothing but trouble. Look at this one," he pointed toward Julian. "Probably a scam artist." Julian felt his stomach twist in a way he hadn't expected. His identity was still hidden, but the way Peter spoke about the homeless people around him made his blood boil. It wasn't just that Peter's words were harsh, it was the complete lack of empathy. Julian had expected some level of judgment, but hearing such disdain from someone he had known as his employee felt like a personal attack. Mark, the manager, tried to downplay the situation. "We don't want any trouble," he said, but his words were weak. He had no intention of standing up to Peter. In that moment, Julian realized that Peter wasn't just indifferent to the homeless. He had no empathy for anyone he deemed beneath him. And worse, Mark, who should have been a moral compass in the restaurant, didn't challenge Peter's behavior. Instead, he tolerated it. Feeling the weight of his own discomfort, Julian made the decision to confront Peter. Not as the millionaire owner, but as the beggar he had been pretending to be. He stood up from his seat, taking a deep breath, and walked toward Peter. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would define everything. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice steady but low. "I overheard what you said about me. You know nothing about me." Peter looked at Julian in surprise, clearly not expecting a confrontation from someone who seemed so insignificant. "And what's it to you?" Peter sneered. "You're nothing but a beggar." But Julian wasn't done. He looked Peter in the eye, his voice colder than before. "You know, it's funny. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who treat me with respect because of the money I have. But I've never seen such a lack of compassion as I've witnessed here today. You, Peter, are everything that's wrong with this world." Peter's face turned red with rage, but Julian didn't back down. This was the moment of reckoning. It wasn't about exposing Peter. It was about exposing the truth that Julian had been hiding from for so long. Julian's words hung in the air between him and Peter like a heavy storm cloud, thick with tension. Peter, now visibly enraged, leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists. He was clearly trying to suppress the urge to lash out physically, but his face was flushed with indignation. "You think you can come in here and talk to me like that?" Peter spat. "You're nobody. Just a filthy beggar." But Julian didn't flinch. He had anticipated this response. He had expected Peter to react with hostility. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about creating a moment that would make Peter and everyone else who had witnessed this interaction question their values. "Maybe I am a beggar," Julian said quietly. "But what you don't know is that I'm the owner of this restaurant. And I've been watching how you treat people, how you treat everyone who doesn't have money to impress you." Peter's expression faltered for a brief moment, his arrogance giving way to disbelief. The staff around them stopped what they were doing and a hushed murmur spread through the room. Julian stood his ground, every word carefully chosen. "I've been here day after day testing the character of everyone in this restaurant. I've seen kindness in some of you, but I've also seen cruelty. And you, Peter, are the worst of them all. You think because you manage this place that you're better than anyone else. But in truth you're a coward." The shock on Peter's face deepened. He looked like he might pass out from the sheer intensity of the confrontation. What do you mean by that?" Peter asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Julian's words cut deep, not just as a revelation, but as a challenge to everything Peter had come to believe about himself. "I mean that you use your position to belittle others, to make them feel small. You act like you're the king of this place. But you've forgotten something very important. It's the people you step on who hold the power. Without them, this place would fall apart." Peter opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was stunned into silence. The room, once full of bustling noise, now felt suffocatingly still. Everyone was waiting for the next move. Finally, Julian turned his gaze to the staff standing nearby. "I want you all to remember this moment," he said, his voice strong. "Kindness should never be measured by the size of someone's paycheck. It's measured by the depth of your humanity." The silence lingered for a few more seconds before Julian turned and walked away from the scene. He didn't need to see Peter's reaction anymore. He had said what needed to be said. As he left the restaurant that day, he felt a strange sense of peace, like a weight had been lifted off his chest. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with mixed emotions for Julian. He had expected some fallout, but not to the extent he was witnessing. When he returned to the restaurant the following week, he found the atmosphere unusually tense. Employees who had once gone about their work with casual ease now seemed more guarded, unsure of how to act around him. It was as if his actions had created a ripple effect that affected everyone, not just Peter. To his surprise, the first person to approach him was Daniel. The young waiter had a look of concern on his face as he stopped by Julian's table. "Hey, I just wanted to check in on you," Daniel said, his tone warm. "What happened the other day? It wasn't right. Peter's always been like that, but it was still messed up. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Julian smiled, touched by Daniel's sincerity. "Thank you, Daniel. You don't have to apologize for him. But I had to say what I said. People like Peter, they need to know that they're not invincible. And others need to see that kindness doesn't depend on status." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. But you're right about one thing. Peter's been running the show with an iron fist for too long. He's made everyone afraid to speak up." He looked around cautiously, lowering his voice. "But honestly, I think things might change now. I've heard some of the other staff talking. People are starting to notice the way we treat each other. It's not just about the customers anymore. It's about respect, among all of us." Julian's heart lifted slightly at the words. It seemed that his actions had sparked something deeper than he had expected. The seed of change had been planted and it was starting to grow. Over the next few days, Julian watched as the dynamics within the restaurant subtly shifted. Employees began to interact with one another more respectfully, and even Peter, though still resentful, was more cautious in his interactions. It was clear that the incident had affected him, though not in the way Julian had hoped. Peter's behavior had softened, but he was still a far cry from being the compassionate leader Julian had hoped for. One afternoon, Mark, the restaurant manager, approached Julian, a hesitant look on his face. "I've been thinking about what you said and I want to apologize for not stepping in sooner," Mark said. "I should have had your back." Julian could tell that Mark was genuinely remorseful. The fact that Mark had come to him without any prompting showed that Julian's words had made an impact. "I appreciate that, Mark. But more than apologies, I want to see action. I want to see us work together to create an environment where people are treated with respect, no matter their role or their wealth." Mark nodded, a new resolve in his eyes. "You're right. I'll do better. We all will." And for the first time since Julian had started his experiment, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to change the culture of this place. To show that true generosity wasn't just about money, it was about humanity. Julian's heart had been heavy with doubt when he first walked into the restaurant that day. Despite the small improvements he had seen, he wasn't convinced that his actions had truly made a lasting impact. He knew that change, especially in a place as steeped in tradition as this restaurant, was never easy. It required patience, persistence, and above all, consistency. But as he observed the staff going about their work, something had shifted. The once dominant cliques that had formed around Peter seemed to have fractured. There was less gossip in the air and more cooperative teamwork. Even the interactions between the kitchen staff and the waiters seemed more harmonious. It wasn't perfect, but Julian could see the difference. As he sat at his usual table, sipping on his coffee, he watched as Daniel helped an older woman with her coat, speaking to her gently and with genuine care. Julian had seen this waiter before, of course, but now there was something in his demeanor that suggested he had embraced the lesson Julian had inadvertently imparted. It was the way Daniel had chosen to treat people regardless of their position or background that made all the difference. Mark, the restaurant manager, approached him with a smile. "How's everything today, Mr. West?" Mark asked, using the respectful tone that had become more common in the past few days. Julian smiled back, recognizing the change. "Much better than last week, Mark. I'm seeing improvements." "I'm glad to hear that," Mark replied, his voice full of pride. "We've been working on it. The staff, they're more aware now, more mindful of how they treat each other. It's made a big difference. Peter's been a little quieter, but I think he's starting to get the message." Julian couldn't help but chuckle. Peter's not going to change overnight. But he'll get there. It's a process. As the day wore on, Julian felt a growing sense of satisfaction. He hadn't just tested the generosity of others. He had planted a seed in the hearts of the people around him. Whether they realized it or not, the entire restaurant had begun to evolve. And with each small change, the community within the walls of the restaurant grew stronger. That evening, as Julian was about to leave, Peter approached him. There was no arrogance in his gait, no pride in his expression. Instead, there was something else: vulnerability. "I owe you an apology," Peter said, his voice low and surprisingly sincere. "I've been a jerk. To you, to the staff. I let this place get to my head. I thought I was untouchable. Julian looked at him, trying to assess the sincerity in his words. I appreciate that, Peter. I didn't do it to embarrass you. I just wanted to show everyone here that kindness matters, no matter where we're from or what we have. Peter nodded as if understanding something deep within himself. Yeah, I get it now. I'll do better. For all of us. As Peter walked away, Julian felt a small but significant shift inside him. Perhaps there was more hope for this place than he had originally thought. With the subtle changes taking root in the restaurant, Julian felt a sense of completion. His initial plan had worked. The staff was more cooperative, more generous, and most importantly, more aware of the power their actions held. But there was one final test to be done. For the next week, Julian kept his usual low profile, observing from the shadows, gauging how things were progressing. The real challenge, he knew, would be whether the changes would be sustained without him present. Could this shift in behavior last, or was it just a fleeting moment of realization? The opportunity for his final test came unexpectedly. One busy evening, a woman with 2 children entered the restaurant. She was dressed in modest clothes and appeared somewhat out of place among the wealthier clientele. Julian couldn't help but notice the way she hesitated at the entrance, as if unsure whether she belonged. Without thinking, Julian stood up and approached her. Good evening, Julian greeted her warmly. How can I help you today? The woman looked up at him, taken aback by his unexpected kindness. Oh, I wasn't sure if we should come in. Seems like such a fancy place. I'm not sure we can afford. Nonsense, Julian interrupted her gently. This is a place for everyone. Please, let me show you to a table. As he led her to a seat, he noticed several of the waitstaff looking up, watching him with interest. Daniel was the first to step forward, offering a friendly smile. Welcome, he said, pulling out the chair for her and her children. Can I get you started with something to drink? The woman looked visibly relieved, her anxiety easing as she settled in. The service was impeccable, but it was the tone of the interactions that mattered most to Julian. The staff were treating her and her children with the same kindness and respect they would offer anyone. It was a far cry from the cold, dismissive attitude Julian had encountered just a few weeks prior. Julian watched for a while, content that the final test was unfolding as he hoped. Peter, who had been walking by, caught sight of him. There was a moment of hesitation before Peter approached him, a cautious but genuine smile on his face. You're doing it, aren't you? Peter said, nodding toward the woman and her children. You've changed this place. For good. Julian smiled. No, Peter. We've all done it. It's not about one person. It's about all of us. For the first time, Julian felt truly confident that his mission had been a success. The restaurant had been transformed, not just in how it treated its customers, but in how it treated its own people. And that, to Julian, was the real victory. As Julian prepared to leave the restaurant that night, he took a moment to absorb the changes around him. The once cold, transactional atmosphere had been replaced by something warmer, more genuine. The staff had grown closer, united by the shared experience of learning that kindness was more powerful than status. They didn't need to know who he truly was for the lesson to stick. It had been a test, yes, but it had also been a catalyst for something far greater. A culture shift that would continue to grow. Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Mark, the restaurant manager. Julian, I wanted to thank you. We've all noticed the difference in the way the staff interacts with customers and with each other. It's been like a weight has lifted. I don't know what happened, but I can see the change in them. And in me. I've started treating my team differently too. Thank you. Julian read the message with a sense of pride. The transformation wasn't just about the restaurant. It had reached into the hearts of the people who worked there, including the manager. His mind drifted to Peter, who had made significant strides in his own attitude. Julian hadn't expected such a quick change from the once arrogant head waiter, but it was clear that the experience had left a lasting impact on him. As Julian stepped out into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of accomplishment that went beyond any wealth or material success. This wasn't just about showing generosity to a few individuals. It was about fostering an environment where empathy and respect were the foundation, where everyone, from the wealthiest patron to the humblest worker, was treated with dignity. He smiled to himself as he made his way down the street. He had done more than teach a lesson about generosity. He had sparked a movement. The restaurant was no longer just a place where people came to eat. It had become a community, a place where kindness was as valued as the food served. The story of his disguise, though, would stay with him for a long time. He would never forget the looks on the faces of the staff when they discovered who he really was. But even more than that, he would remember the sense of unity that had been born from his simple experiment. It wasn't about the money he had. No, it was about the power to influence people's lives in meaningful ways. It was about seeing potential in others, about lifting them up instead of tearing them down. The restaurant, once divided by pride and arrogance, was now united by something stronger, a shared belief in the power of kindness. And Julian West had played his part in it all. But his work was far from over. In the end, he realized that this was only the beginning. There were other places to change, other lives to touch. And no matter where he went, the lesson would remain the same. True generosity wasn't about what you gave but how you made others feel. With that thought in mind, Julian walked off into the night, ready to take on the world once more.